All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know we have a art event going on campus tonight, so at first I was like, wow, there's a lot of people to hear my talk, but it turns out they're not here. No. Let's go, otherwise I'd be nervous. So tonight, I don't have to introduce anybody, and I realized that I didn't get anybody to introduce me, so I'm going to do my own introduction in a slightly different way. All right, so tonight I'm going to be talking about adventures in wilderness research and weaving it into several different topics as we go, and I'm going to see how this goes. This is a talk I've never presented before, but every talk I give is like that, so it shouldn't be anything too crazy. I did put up on here 3 things that we're going to do tonight. One is we're going to do some in-class activities. 2, we're going to hear some quotes from famous people. And 3, we're going to see pictures of weasels. And about 12 hours ago, a picture on Facebook went viral. It was a picture of a weasel on is it a woodpecker? Oh, yeah. So I took that as a good sign of tonight's talk. As far as I know, the weasel on the woodpecker is actually an ermine or a short-tailed weasel that I've spent a lot of years studying. So for my introduction, I thought instead of introducing myself, I would just put up a picture that a 5-year-old drew for me the other day. One of my best friends from high school back in Detroit, we went out to dinner. I've actually never met her children, and I realized it had been 6 years since I had seen her, since my grandmother passed away. And I went home because my dad, born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, is getting ready to embark on a 5-month journey from Mexico to Canada along the Continental Divide Trail at the age of 64. And he doesn't know what it's like to pack over 600,000 calories worth of food. So he called in reinforcements, aka his daughter. So while I was home, I met with Leanne and we went out to dinner, and her 5-year-old decided to draw a picture for me while we were talking. And so over the course of our conversation, this is what he drew. And I thought it did a really great job of kind of explaining my world. This right here is a minion. They're really popular right now with 5-year-olds from Despicable Me. And there's 2 kinds of minions. There's yellow minions and purple minions. And purple minions eat the yellow minions. He thinks that I'm a yellow minion, for whatever that's worth. And I often do feel like a minion, so that fits well. This over here is an explosion. I think just kind of general acknowledgement to the chaos that ensues in all of our lives. Mine is no different. This is an igloo. We were talking about up north, and I spent a lot of years in Alaska. We'll talk a little bit about that tonight. And so there's the igloo. This over here is a jet plane. I like to refer to that as my philanthropist that I hope to someday meet that will fund all of the really cool projects I would like to do. So that's the jet plane. And then this entity in the middle is called Mr. S. I think has some reference to some cartoon. But it kind of, according to Gavin, Mr. S controls this whole scene. And I think of all the different things I do, and there's probably some kind of something pulling a lot of strings. So when all else fails, we can just blame Mr. S for things. So that's my introduction. So this is what I was doing last week. I was helping my dad pack food, 138 days worth, like I said, over 600,000 calories. My mom has had a total transformation in the last 1.5 years, going from not wanting my dad to go on the hike at all, because they've actually, in 45 years of marriage, never spent more than 4 days apart, to helping me pack food. So it's been a family journey on a lot of different levels. And this represents 25 resupplies that my dad's going to have throughout his journeys. So while I was putting this talk together, I was working on rations for this trip and his own journey of sorts. So tonight I'm going to talk about how wilderness, and particularly the research from a biological standpoint that I've done in wilderness has kind of shaped me as an individual, and hopefully give a little bit of introduction to the idea of how we as individuals develop sense of place and the different ways we do that. And of course, the whole point of this lecture series is to show the different values in which we associate wilderness. And for me, developing a sense of place is probably one of the most striking values of wilderness. And so we're going to start in Michigan. We're going to travel to Montana in a couple different areas. I might make some mention of some work that I've done in Central America, and then we'll also travel up here to the North Country. So because I'm a biogeographer, I feel like I have to show a map every time I start a talk. It just helps me orient myself. This is where I'm from, and our first topic is going to take us up here to a place called the Kenai Peninsula in the state of Michigan. So, how I shape my sense of place, and what I have gained through years of research in wilderness. And we'll come full circle to this photo because a lot of my work now is more on the educational front than it is on the research front. But how I got to this point is largely because of what I've done up to it. So, Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. Some of you might know the name Sleeping Bear Dunes because it is our most recent designated wilderness area. The lakeshore itself has been under federal ownership for a very long time as a national lakeshore, which you can think of in terms of protection on the same level as a national park. It constitutes the west side of the northern coast of the southern peninsula of Michigan. Lake Michigan is the lake that, that the dunes border. It's also about 75,000 acres, 32,000 acres of which were designated wilderness in 2014 in our most recently passed wilderness bill. However, it has a really neat story associated with it. So first I would like to tell you that story. It's an Ottawa and Chippewa story, and there's a couple variations on it, but I'm going to tell you the one that I was told as a child. The legend states that long before the coming of white men, Mishimokwa, the mother bear, and her twin cubs were driven from the shores of Wisconsin by fire and famine into the waters of Lake Michigan. Having no other choice, the three set out for the distant shoreline of Michigan. Their hearts were filled with fear, for their journey seemed impossible. After swimming many hours, the Michigan shoreline came into view, what is now Sleeping Bear Dunes. However, the effort had taken its toll, and exhausted by the long swim, the cubs, one at a time, disappeared below the water, drowning in the, in the deeper waters of Lake Michigan. Mishimokwa, longing for her cubs, stood upon the shore and waited for them day after day to no avail. Finally, she laid down to sleep and wait forever. The Great Spirit Manitou, deeply sensing Mishimokwa's love and longing, caused her two cubs to rise up out of the water and become islands, which he named after himself, the North and South Manitou Island. To mark the resting place for Mishimokwa, the mother bear, and mark her love and longing for her cubs, he covered her with sand, forming what is now known as the Sleeping Bear Dune. And so that's where the place gets its name, is the Sleeping Bear Dune. This is a photo taken by my parents on one of our family vacations in the 1980s. This is a photo from the 1930s showing a closer up view of what many consider to look like a sleeping bear. So if you ask most people that grew up in Michigan, they can recite some version of this story. Or if you ask them, what is the Sleeping Bear Dunes, they'll say, oh yeah, I heard this story once about these cubs that drowned, and there's this one big dune, and that the mother dune, Mishimokwa, is actually about 400 feet high. It's a really popular spot for families to go growing up. Lake Michigan in general is a vacation spot, and this dune is, you'll see a lot of family photos of people that grew up in Michigan running up and down that particular dune, because 400 feet in Michigan is actually a significant amount of elevation gain. So this was also my first introduction to any kind of wilderness type activity, was actually hiking along these dunes. And Lake Michigan, given that it's one of our Great Lakes, you can't actually see across it when you sit on the Michigan shoreline. As a kid, you sit there and you stare at the far shore and you think if you blur your eyes enough, you can actually see the state of Wisconsin, but you can't. It's not possible. And so my connection with place started here in what is now actually a designated wilderness, but at the time the concept of wilderness wasn't something I thought about or even knew about or questioned. But this would come back to me. So in college, where I went to school in Michigan, we had several freshwater ecology courses, dune ecology courses, where we specifically focused on Lake Michigan and other Great Lake ecosystems for a lot of our work. And I found myself for 3 years during the school year on a field crew that was looking at perched dune systems. And the Sleeping Bear Dunes are one of only 2 perched dune systems in the US. And they're called perched dunes because they form when water levels are high. And winds will blow sand off the bluffs that are directly next to the water up into the uplands and deposit sand. In years when the water is low, they don't get that sand deposit, and thus you can tell what level the lake is at year after year after year. And so in long-term studies, we can look at rises and falls in freshwater lakes in Michigan to discuss, everything from water and how it's going to affect the river systems to contemporary and future climate change within the region. So I spent 3 years with backpacks and shovels taking dune samples on a weekly basis across the Sleeping Bear Dunes. And at the time, I didn't know that there were certain things we had to do, such as minimum analyses and minimum tool requirements, because this is technically treated as a wilderness even before it was designated as a wilderness. But these are things that I will talk about that I've come to learn over time. So from there, we'll move to Glacier National Park. This was my next bout with wilderness research. The Greater Grizzly DNA project began in 1997. It was the precursor to what became the Northern Continental Divide grizzly bear DNA study that many folks are probably familiar with. It was originally intended to provide a population estimate for grizzly bears in Glacier National Park, and then was expanded to include the whole Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, which at the time was an incredibly large undertaking for a DNA study, because this is 1997, and the DNA technologies are only recently being used to assess populations outside of human crime scene investigations. So the total study area became over 9,600 square miles of northwestern Montana. And in order to effectively gain a population estimate, they had to standardize sampling using a 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer grid system. So you can imagine, if you're trying to get a lot of samples in that area, how many trap sites or other type of sampling localities you're going to have to provide. And they figured out the best way to do this was by rigging up hair snares. So what they did is every 2 kilometers they would wrap a tree or set up amongst many trees across barbed wire systems so that a bear would have to walk under, over, or through barbed wire and leave a hair sample. And so from this, I became a part of a crew for 2 seasons that sampled areas throughout Glacier National Park, collecting these small hair samples that were used in genetic analyses. Now you can Google how many bears are there in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, and a number between 700 and 850 will pop up. And that's what 2.5 decades of work will do. You end up on Google. One of our field sites was located on Pitamaqueen Pass in Glacier National Park. And this was a place I visited with my family on our first backpacking trip. And Pitamaqueen was a woman warrior. Her prior name, she was a Blackfeet woman. She was the only Blackfoot woman to assume a male warrior name, and she was given that name because of her fierceness in battle. Her name prior to Pitamaqueen was Weasel Woman. And when I heard this story, I thought, oh, that's so cool. What exactly is a weasel? And little did I know that I would spend the next 10 years of my life working on DNA and weasels. But before we get there, real quick, one other wilderness project that I did prior to what would kind of become my defining work in wilderness research was some work in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So the hatch mark here indicates what is considered the grizzly bear primary habitat region within the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And of course, this here is the national park. In the 1980s, National Park Service biologists from Yellowstone National Park in this remote southeast corner of the park noticed that grizzly bears were seen frequenting areas between 10 and 12,000 feet in elevation. And they were rummaging through talus slopes as if they were looking for something. And they could not figure out why bears were, A, up that high, and B, how they were able to stay up high like that for months on end. They would stay up there in some cases for 2 months. And so they started looking at what are the potential food sources that bears are consuming while they're in these areas. In the late 1990s, they discovered that it was actually E. auxiliaris, which its common name is the army cutworm moth, or what some may know as the miller moth. It's an agricultural pest throughout much of the Midwest and the West. It's also a primary food source for grizzly bears in high elevation sites throughout the Rocky Mountain regions. So I participated in some of the first field sites. We looked at 87 sites throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem to assess how many bears were feeding on army cutworm moths, at what times of day, what the moths were feeding on, and what times of year moths would migrate to and from these high alpine sites. The army cutworm moth is a really interesting agricultural pest and a really interesting insect species. It migrates up to some cases over 800 kilometers. In China, they've actually got it migrating over 1,300 kilometers. It tends to go from lowlands to very high alpine sites. So it's a pretty dynamic flyer because it has to deal with a lot of different changes in wind currents. It's about half a calorie a moth. Grizzly bears consume up to 40,000 moths a day. So it's about 20,000 calories of moths. And they have very distinctive markings on them. You can find them. I've actually found them in my house here in Missoula. They have a little kidney bean shape on their wings when their wings are folded back. And that's what distinguishes E. auxiliaris from other moths in its same order. So how do you do high elevation grizzly bear and moth sampling in wilderness areas and somehow maintain the wilderness character of your specific study sites? This was my first introduction to what we now know as leave no trace ethics. The idea that we try to go into an area, stay there, and then leave as if we were never there at all. And I had a field leader at the time, the woman whose PhD work this was a part of in the end, who practiced leave no trace ethics to a T. So we packed in and packed out everything that we brought in, including any kind of defecation, any kind of water that we used to cook with. So for example, you might cook yourself a meal and there's some water left in the pot afterwards. We would have to take turns drinking the water. There was no scattering the water. So that was my first introduction to what it can mean to really do wilderness-based research. The other thing is you have to think about how you're going to operate what might otherwise be an electrical system at 11 or 12,000 feet in a wilderness area. And so for moths, what we were trying to do was capture these moths, because we were going to do a DNA study to look at where the moths were coming from, which agricultural fields in Wyoming and the Dakotas the moths were migrating from up to these high elevation sites in the greater Yellowstone. In order to do that, this is what I would carry in my backpack. A large solar panel that was about this big by that big, a 12-gallon bucket, which you can see here, it's covered by rocks, a 12-volt battery that weighed 10 pounds that's in that bucket, a series of plastic screens with a light bulb, a fluorescent light bulb in the middle of this, a metal pan of sorts that went on top as a lid, 20 pounds of ethanol that went into the bucket here, and then some wiring that ran from the solar panel to the battery. And so what happens is during the day, the solar panel would charge a battery that at night would flip a switch and let this light go on. The moths, like any moths, would be attracted to the light. They would smack into these plastic screens that we had, and they would fall into, oh yeah, there's a funnel that I carried as well. They would fall into a funnel into the bucket that had ethanol at the bottom of it and drown. And we would take these moths back for DNA sampling over time. So this weighed, with food and gear, anywhere between 90 and 110 pounds. And we were a crew of 4 that would operate for 2 field seasons, and then in the fall we would don John Deere hats and go into the agricultural fields in Wyoming and ask ranchers if we could sample moths in their agricultural fields. But we had several adventures with packs of this size and weight. And one of our adventures encompassed this hill. We would hike up to this. There's actually a way to kind of scramble up through there because one of our sites was at the top. This is Sunlight Basin and Sunlight Peak, and we called this the Hill of Doom because the hill is actually concave. So it's amazing what a person can do with that much weight on their back when you're forced to do it. And my dad used to joke that I did an awful lot of things for $15 a day. So anyway, one of the kind of additional side notes of this project is that we spent 2 field seasons cataloging the minutia of all alpine tundra flowering plant species because we had read and been told that these moths feed on alpine flowers. But we could never find an actual moth feeding on these alpine flowers. And that's a whole other part of this project, but the general day's rhythm was that you would sleep during the day, and then at night we would get up and we would put headlamps on that had red lenses that we cut out a red saran wrap so that the moths wouldn't be attracted to them, and then we would take butterfly nets and we would spend all night catching moths. And we would hope that eventually we would catch a moth on a flower. And collectively, for a year and a half, we didn't catch any moths on any flowers. And then the very last field site of the last season of this project, we were walking out of Coulter Canyon, which is a northern canyon in Grand Teton National Park. And I shone my light down on the ground, and I saw a moth way lower in elevation than we thought moths went during that part of the summer with its proboscis stuck in a sedge. So afterwards, we figured out that these moths actually feed on sedges, not on alpine flowers. But we have a lot of alpine flower data out there in case someone ever wants to use it. So from here, we moved to Alaska. And of course, wilderness research, as we learned from Alan Watson, there's a lot of impressionable adventures that can happen if you're a wilderness researcher working in Alaska. My original direction towards Alaska came from a letter that I wrote to the Fish and Wildlife Service in the late 1990s asking them if they needed any help, and that I was a student in college in Michigan, but I had heard that Alaska was pretty neat and that I had worked a couple seasons on trail crew, and I wanted to go into biology, and did they have any work for me anywhere in Alaska? And somebody wrote me back. So I ended up working on the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge down here on the Kenai Peninsula. And this is what, besides the DNA and the weasel reference earlier, this is kind of what got me thinking about future wilderness-based research. As you can see, the Kenai is a peninsula with a very narrow isthmus here that connects it to mainland Alaska. This is less than 15 miles across before you hit water. And so for all intensive purposes, the Kenai Peninsula acts as an island. And if you look through different records that describe plant and animal species for Alaska, you'll find a lot of references to Kenaiensis. It's usually a subspecific level categorization for many plants and mammal species. Paramiscus, for example, the deer mouse, has a distinct subspecies that's found on the Kenai Peninsula. The black bears on Kenai Peninsula have been described as a distinct subspecies. And that's largely because there's very little migration of individual organisms across this very narrow connection to mainland Alaska. And it makes sense, right? Because if you look at it, we go from the Kenai Mountains to the Chugach Mountains up here. And this is, I mean, these are big glaciated mountains. There's lots of water and glaciers in between these little fingers here, between the actual topographic features, and it's not fun territory to have to walk across if you're an animal species. So for all intensive purposes, this acts as an island, and some of the original work I was doing down here was looking at wolf population dynamics and whether or not a recent predator eradication program on the Kenai Peninsula would mean the loss of particular wolf packs, because we didn't know at the time if the wolf packs were being colonized by additional individuals from mainland Alaska. And some of our research showed that what's down here on the Kenai tends to be what you're looking at as far as wildlife. So here's just a couple shots. There's a picture of one of our bears that we were working with, a young female. One of the other things that I was working on at the time was a cormorant survey to look at which rock islands in some of the larger lakes, like Ski Lac Lake down on the Kenai Peninsula, were being used as nesting sites for cormorants. And we did a lot of work with lynx for one season because National Geographic was interested in looking at lynx in Alaska. And unfortunately, government projects are not immune to the whims of videographers, and so we had to walk in on several different lynx dens while I was down there to get some shots of lynx for a National Geographic special on lynx. Unfortunately, this tends to stress these animals out quite a bit. Cats are very particular about denning sites, and so this female, every single time we walked in on her, and it took several times in order to get the shots that they wanted, would move her kittens, because she had kittens at the time, and they won't stay in a place after there's been human contact. So from my work on the Kenai, I became connected with the University of Alaska Fairbanks and the Museum of the North. And I started a whole other type of research. So up until now, aside from the trapping of bears and wolves and lynx on the Kenai, I had largely done non-invasive projects. Most of it had been done within designated wilderness or de facto wilderness, and I had tried to use the minimum tools required, or I'd been told to do so by the people I worked for. And then I started in with museum research, which is a little bit different in the sense that there's a take involved. You're actually collecting a specimen, because the value is not just in categorizing that or documenting that, yes, that individual is located here, but in actually having that tangible specimen that can be part of a collection. And it took me a couple years to really swallow this idea. One of the reasons why was because I was deathly afraid that I was going to come back in my next life as a dead mammal, because I had killed so many at that point. And secondly, because I thought it was incredibly invasive. But over time, I came to understand the value in these museum collections, such as some of the work we've seen done with the Berkeley Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, where they've gone back 100 years later to document the effects of climate change based on specimens that were collected. And so this is the idea of museum-based research, and this all happened in the field. It was a long-term project with the Park Service in Alaska, as well as what was called the Beringian Coevolution Project. It was a National Science Foundation grant that we had for many years for this project. We would collect small mammals, so basically a field crew would be dropped off. Me and potentially 3 undergraduate students that were working with me would be dropped off in a remote area in one of Alaska's national parks or monuments. We would spend 10 days. We would trap everything we could. However, we could only take 5 of every species. And these were small things, marmots and smaller. And so what we would do is collect those species. We would do what was called a museum preparation on them, which means we would take a skin sample, we would take a bone or a full skeleton, we would take tissue samples, heart, lung, liver, kidney, and intestines for internal parasites. We would also look at ectoparasites. So there were many times where I'd be dissecting a small shrew and a flea would jump on me, and then I'd spend the rest of the day trying to find the flea. What you can imagine when you're out in the field for several months at a time stressing about fleas is something is a very plausible thing. And then from our endoparasite work, we would also take blood samples to look at viruses and potentially isolates of those viruses. And then every single sample that's ever been collected as part of these projects has a georeference. You can now actually go onto what's called the Arctos database, where all of this information is cataloged, and georeference a specific specimen to a specific place in one of Alaska's national parks. And monuments. Much of this took place in wilderness. Much of Alaska's national parks is considered wilderness and therefore had to go through rigorous analysis before this work could be deemed appropriate for the area. And every single park had different requirements. So it was specimen-based research. We were definitely primarily trying to catalog for the National Park Service what they had in their national parks. Some of this came on the heels of ANILCA, which was a Lands Act passed in 1980 that established a lot of new wilderness areas and national parks in Alaska. And subsequent to that, the Park Service got some inventory and monitoring money to look at what kind of species were found in these parks. In order to get to a lot of these places, we had to use float planes and boats. And for those of us in the lower 48 that think about wilderness, this might seem like it's outside the box of traditional wilderness, and it is. In many of Alaska's wilderness areas, you can take boats and you can take float planes, and it's an issue of access. And it's something that's very much still debated in the wilderness community, both in and outside of Alaska, is what kind of use and what kind of modes of transportation should be allowed in wilderness areas. And for those of you that may have gone to other lectures in our series, last year we had Kevin Hood, who is a Forest Service ranger in Alaska, who talked about some of these impacts in Southeast Alaska with a lot of boat tours going through wilderness areas. So there is an impact. These research vessels are large. So that's an 85-foot boat. And of course, float planes are intrusive as well. Overall, outside of just getting field crews on the ground to catalog what was there, we had kind of a larger research question, which is looking across these wild landscapes in Alaska and the species compositions there, could we, through genetic studies and morphological studies of those museum specimens, link some of these species to species in Russia, looking at the historic connections that would have occurred with transboundary migrations of species during the Pleistocene, while Beringia was actually a landmass. So of course, this is that rather shallow bridge, what used to be called the Bering Land Bridge. It's now covered by shallow water, but at points in time in the past, connected to Alaska. And so a lot of the species that you look at in Alaska are just a few generations removed from species that you might find in Russia and Siberia. So from here, we start talking about weasels. So from this work, I started to think about my own interests and where I wanted to go in life. And pretty much there's two things that I've known most of my life. One is I have a really short attention span, and two is that I need to move around a lot. And those probably go hand in hand. So I thought about, what could I study? What would require me to spend a lot of time outside in wild places? I would have to move around a lot, and potentially would answer some really interesting questions in evolutionary biology, which was the field of study that I was interested in going into. And I settled on weasels. So that's that family of organisms down here. If we look across, Mammalia is an order. These are all the different groups, and mustelids are actually the most diverse group of carnivores out there. So if you think about mustelids and weasels, it's everything from badgers and wolverine all the way down to little tiny least weasels that aren't much bigger than a large bull, about this big. So not only body size and body shape is there a lot of variation, but also in modes of communication, in modes of travel, in modes of feeding, in types of behavior. So a very diverse family of organisms. So that's what I decided to settle on. And so here's some of our well-known weasels. This here is the ermine. That's the one I think was holding on to the woodpecker in the picture that went viral on Facebook, but I can't tell you for sure. And of course, many weasel species have both a winter and summer color. And so some recent work that I've just started doing in collaboration with a few other scientists is looking at whether the timing of pelage coloration change is similar for weasels as we see in snowshoe hares. So a former professor from was working on that with snowshoe hares, and so we teamed up to start looking at that pelage variation, coat color change timing in weasels that we've seen in other species. So, weasels. I didn't know how difficult they were actually going to be to catch. Had I known that, I might not have chosen them. However, I decided to do a PhD, which meant I was in school for a really long time, and I had a lot of years to catch weasels. So over the years, I perfected the process. One, you have to think like one. So you have to take, in the case of rainforest areas along coastal Canada, British Columbia largely, and then coastal southeast Alaska, this meant walking on large down trees, 100 to 200 meters off the ground there. And this is where I would set traps, because the weasels, like humans, would use these areas like a game of chutes and ladders to move from one area to another. This is a very natural microburst in a forest, an old-growth forest in southeast Alaska. Also, I was working in a lot of wilderness. Specifically for a lot of my work, I worked in Tebenkoff Bay Wilderness, the QU Wilderness, and the Kootznoowoo Wilderness on Admiralty Island. And in order to do that, I had to do a minimum tools analysis and minimum requirements analysis. So for that, I had to think about a couple things. I wasn't going to be able to use motorized vehicles. I wasn't going to be able to use boats in some cases, or float planes. I was going to have to find a lightweight way to get a lot of traps on the ground to sample. Another issue was I couldn't live trap because I wasn't going to be able to visit my sites very often, since I was going to have to walk long distances between trap sites. And I did not want to take animals. I didn't want to have to kill them, because I was dealing with small populations of individuals that were already marked as potentially endangered or at least decreasing. So I came up with, through a series of trial and errors, different ways of establishing traps. And so you might find yourself at some point in the future losing sleep over a question like, how over a 400 square kilometer area can I spread out enough barbed wire and sticky glue so that I can get at least 500 hair samples, because I need that in order to get any kind of population estimate. So these are the kinds of things I drew in my notebooks at night. And what I ended up doing first was mailboxes. I went to the Juneau Empire and the Albuquerque Journal, because I was working and living in Juneau and Albuquerque similarly at that time. And I asked them for as many spare mailboxes as they had, the plastic mailboxes that people used to put out to get the newspaper. At the time, newspapers were just starting to go out of fashion, so they happened to have a lot of these newspaper boxes available. So I used those, and I don't have a photo of them, unfortunately, but I spent the first couple seasons burying these newspaper boxes in soil with just a little bit of the opening available, and I would put a piece of dead something, whether it be old chicken meat or deer carcass from a deer that I killed, or duck meat from hunters in Petersburg or small towns in Alaska that would give me extra meat, and I would stick it in the back of the trap so that the weasel would have to wiggle its way into the newspaper box, grab the meat, and the meat was removable, so I was hoping to get only one individual per trap, and then it would wiggle its way out. And every time it wiggled, it would hit these little sticky glue pads that were actually, if anyone's seen those rat traps that they put in freezers in restaurants, they're just big. They're big squares of glue. It's an industrial strength glue. And the glue is supposed to hold the hair even in cold weather. So that was another thing I had to think about, is these hair samples were going to be out for multiple days in the rain, potentially snow, definitely getting frosted, and I needed to have DNA that was not degraded to the point where I couldn't analyze it in the lab. So for the most part, this worked. However, I found out that daddy longlegs, the spiders, actually really like the smell of that glue or something. They're attracted to those glue pads. So I would come into these trap sites and I would have some hair samples, but then I'd have 30 daddy longlegs. And it got to be such a pain that I had to come up with a different style. So the one that I ended up going with for most of my work was a PVC pipe trap. And instead of these sticky glue pads, I used gun brushes. And what eventually sold me on the gun brushes was I had set about 100 sticky glue traps across a river on one of the islands that I worked on. It had been a really long day, and I was coming back, and my graduate advisor had come out with me, and so I was trying to show off this one particular area and my trapping method. And a black bear walked across a log about 30 feet in front of us and stopped and looked, and he put his paw down, and he had a big white square right there. And my graduate advisor goes, "Isn't that one of your sticky glue pads on that bear's foot?" And the bear had just annihilated half my traps. So I decided to go with the PVC pipes because I could put them on trees, I could wire them to trees, I could put barbed wire with scent for bears on other trees to attract them to rub on those trees to stay away from my trap site. So this methodology ended up working out the best. And I got some really awesome external frame backpacks that could hold 25 of those traps at a time. So there was a lot of thought that went into that. And those traps are still being used. We're still using them for work up in this area. So this is just a map of the Tongass National Forest where I've done a lot of research in wilderness. And there's 19 different wilderness areas on the Tongass. And so many of them are rather large. As you can see, the Kootznoowoo is Tlingit for Fortress of the Bears. Admiralty Island is what we call a brown bear island. In southeast Alaska, we've found out that the black bears and brown bears segregate themselves on islands. So on islands where you see brown bears, which are coastal grizzlies, you will not find black bears. On islands where you find brown bears, you will find, you'll not find wolves. But on black bear islands, you'll find wolves. So there's an interesting predator dynamic that we've figured out over the years of working up there. Some wilderness areas are smaller, such as these two on QU Island where I worked. And of course, because it's an island system, going back to that view of the Kenai Peninsula, you can see that even within one island, like QU, there's many different lobes, as we call them, and each of these lobes acts almost as an independent island system. And so working down here on the Tebenkoff Bay Wilderness, all the pine marten have really big ears. They're kind of like pointy fruit bat ears. And it's only found in that population on that one area, on that part of that island on QU. And I've looked at thousands of pine marten over the years. And it's a really interesting morphological feature that's only found there. The pine marten, which are a larger weasel species, the pine marten on Admiralty National Monument here in the Kootznoowoo Wilderness are golden blonde. They have a beautiful blonde color, lighter than my hair color coat. And therefore, a lot of trappers actually don't trap that island because it's not, it doesn't fetch as high of a price on the fur market. Because pine marten are a readily trapped species everywhere. They can fetch up to $150 per pelt on the fur market, depending on the year. So they're actually a somewhat prized trap species, but not those ones because they're gold. So of those 19 areas, a lot of my work focusing on weasels looked particularly at 7 different wilderness areas. And I did use areas that were outside of wilderness as well. However, on the Tongass National Forest, the wilderness areas are largely untouched as far as previous logging activity, whereas areas outside of wilderness have been heavily logged. What is a little bit difficult, however, is that most of the logged areas on this forest are the big old growth forests, the 800 to 1200-year-old forests, whereas most of the wilderness areas are lowland muskeg, or what we call northern bog areas with black spruce, and some cedar and hemlock and spruce species, but not as old as the older growth species, as the older growth forests. So I had to do some sampling outside of wilderness areas just to try to get that full matrix of forest types in the region. So wilderness areas are natural laboratories. We've heard that from a couple other speakers. And it's not unusual for researchers at some point to gravitate towards wilderness areas because they do provide us with baseline data. And there's several projects that I've put together over the years and helped with based on some of the work that's been done in these wilderness areas. The AIM Up program was a program that was funded by the National Science Foundation in one of my last years of work at the Museum of Southwestern Biology in Albuquerque, where we focused on providing mentor experiences for students from reservations in New Mexico and Arizona that were coming into college. And those mentorship experiences were based on field work in my field sites in Southeast Alaska and in some of our parkland sites, and then follow up with museum work after they did the field collections. And so we were able to use museums as a tool for getting students to participate in research activities, and with an older student mentor to give them that mentorship. The National Phenology Network has been a longtime partner with a lot of our work in wilderness because, again, these provide a lot of baseline data sets for, in my line of work, mammal diversity studies. So we've worked with them over the years collecting plant information as we've been out there collecting mammal information on the ground. And different programs for getting volunteers and student groups out there as well to collect this information. And this is the Volunteer for Conservation program that we have through the Wilderness Institute that focuses on wilderness-based research. So all of this work together, we put together these interesting stories of species assemblages in various wilderness areas in Alaska primarily, but also some of our work down here in the lower 48. Like I said, I primarily focused on the mustelids, although just by happenstance and given that my field sites tended to be remote, so I had to collect whatever information I could while I was out there. We also did a lot of work on an endemic deer species, the Sitka black-tailed deer, and the endemic Alexander archipelago wolf, who, if folks are following wildlife news, was listed as was petitioned for listing as an endangered subspecies, and subsequently has been the product of a lot of recent debate in the genetics literature. We also looked at using this idea of species diversity, how species get to places. Do they come from the north? Do they come from the south? Do they come from different refugia? And this is all in response to long-term climate change. And so I'm interested in looking at historical patterns and processes to then model what may happen in the future with climate change. And of course, again, wilderness areas provide great baselines for that. So I want to skip through my genetics. I put some of these in case folks have questions afterwards about the nitty-gritty. And skip on to just kind of the broader perspective, which is that all of these very species-specific studies, whether we're talking about trapping black bears on the Kenai Peninsula to collecting moths at high elevation sites in the greater Yellowstone, are questions that get out, how do we discern patterns on the landscape and associate the processes that drive those patterns over time? And I started out my academic career as an evolutionary biologist, but moved more into biogeography as time went on, partially because I have an affinity for maps, but also because I had an interest in going broader scale than just looking at specific small scale processes and patterns. And so some of our work now is predictive in the sense that taking the year's worth of data that we've collected in different regions, and a lot of this work was from our original National Park Service data sets, we're trying to predict what might happen with climate change in the future. We're seeing the displacement of species like tundra hare with snowshoe hare, and so we're trying to model why, what that might look like in the future as far as numbers or what species might be lost. So with time, I came across a different motivator. For a lot of years, I was really interested in research, and in 2010, I taught my first field course. And I had been working with students a lot in the field, but I had never taught a formal course actually in the field. And I spent 45 days with students in Southeast Alaska, visiting a lot of my former field sites and taking them out to do some beach sampling and working with them on some different field activities. And I thought, this is great. I can share the information that I've collected over decades that's largely really boring to a lot of people, but do it in a really fun way because we're on the ground. They're actually seeing things. We can trap pine marten. We can trap ermine. And This led me to teach for a couple years in a field school that's actually based out of here in Missoula. And in 2012, this quote came out. There was a big push through the National Science Foundation, which has always been one of my large granting institutions, to really push students forward in experiential education. And it sounds great, but it's actually very hard to do on the ground. And so I started to kind of go through an identity crisis. Did I want to become a researcher and follow that path, or did I want to focus more on education? And how would my years of wilderness research and experience feed into either one of those trajectories, and what would that look like? So, my identity crisis. I ran across a quote by Howard Zahniser, who was one of the authors of the Wilderness Act, and he wrote, "Scientific values of wilderness not only pertain to research and original investigation, but also to the study and observation that are essentially educational in their purpose. Wilderness areas, including the smaller areas and also the extensive wild regions, should accordingly be preserved for the sake of the field study that they make possible for students in each generation. They serve this purpose for the summer camps of youth organizations, for field stations of college summer school classes, and also for the more advanced excursions of graduate students. Thus, the most profound of all wilderness values in our modern world is an educational value." And that was excerpted from The Need for Wilderness Areas, which was a precursor to the writing that he did for the Wilderness Act. So, I agree with Aldo Leopold. That's my identity crisis. I agree with Aldo Leopold when he says, "As a matter of fact, there is no higher or more exciting sport than that of ecological observation." And in fact, for many years, that was my primary sport. It was ecological observation. However, that given time and experience, I would argue that there's a lot of other exciting sports and activities that can further develop both our sense of place as well as our understanding of the natural and not so natural world around us. Which leads me to the final topic of tonight's talk, which is what I think out of all this research talk and those graphs I skipped over of all the long years of genetic work, and I know I never get to them, but I feel like I have to put them in there just because it was so much work to get to that point. But sense of place and belonging. And I will forever say that out of all the values that wilderness has to me as a researcher, it really comes down to this. Author and advocate Wallace Stegner wrote in his essay, The Sense of Place, "I doubt we will ever get the motion out of Americans, for everything in our culture of opportunity and abundance has, up till now, urged motion on us as a form of virtue. Our tradition of restlessness will not be outgrown in a generation or two, even if the motives for restlessness are withdrawn. It is probably time we settled down. Neither the country nor the society we built out of it can be healthy until we stop raiding and running and learn to be a quiet part of the time, and acquire the sense not of ownership, but of belonging. We need to look around us instead of looking ahead." So with that, I would like to show you a few photos in an attempt to have each person in the room reflect on his or her own sense of place. We each have specific innate identifiers, and there's a lot of psychological research that's gone into this. But there's certain environmental or social cues that we use to develop an immediate connection or sense of place, or not a connection or sense of place with our surroundings. Okay, so first, these 4 photos. I would like you to just look at these 4 photos, and in your mind, choose the photo that immediately comes up as your favorite. Don't second guess yourself, just choose what comes first. Okay, so how many people chose photo number 1? Photo number 2? 3? Okay, and photo 4. Okay, so I don't have the time to talk through what it might be that that brings you to each of those photos. But every time I show these to different groups, I'll get different answers. I don't always use the exact same photos, but I usually have a mountain photo, a group photo of people out somewhere camping, a city photo, and then kind of that urban, wild, transitional photo. And depending on the group, tends to usually be geographic location. I'll have more of the room raise their hand with this photo or that photo instead of one of these two, where most of the people in the room tonight put their hands up for this photo. I recently did this actually at a UM Days for freshman orientation, and most people chose, I think it was this, the canoe photo. So we all have certain identifiers. Just one other real quick activity, 3 more photos. Again, so just in your mind, which of the photos strikes you most strongly upon immediate viewing? All right, so again, how many people chose photo 1? The snowstorm. All right, we're missing winter. Photo 2, the rainforest. Okay, and photo 3, rock. All right, cool. So again, different identifiers, they're cues that we have. And so just think about, what are the things that when you go through a day's rhythm, what are some of your environmental cues or social cues that make you feel at home in a given area, that make you kind of breathe easier versus those that keep you on edge? You have heightened awareness. These are all things that help us develop a sense of place and belonging that drive a lot of our actions that as we progress through life in a lot of different ways. So in the literature and research, wilderness is often communicated as one particular region where we can teach a very strong sense of place for many different reasons, from aesthetic beauty to lack of distractions, need for intimate knowledge of the environment, etc. And this is a very powerful advocacy tool for wilderness, its educational value, its ability to teach with absolutely no facilitation necessary. Howard Zionizer, again, in his Need for Wilderness, wrote, "In a culture like that, which we call modern, we can be sure that it will be increasingly important for students of the present and of future generations to know what wilderness has to teach through their own experiences, through educators who are informed and corrected by wilderness experiences." I love that, who are informed and corrected. I've done a lot of things that have corrected me over the years. Through photographs, paintings, writings, and other educational and informational materials with a validity ensured by a still living wilderness. However, to take it one step further, how do we translate this sense of place into the human world, the trammeled landscape versus the untrammeled landscape of wilderness? How do we take that deep understanding of what we might learn about ourselves or about place and translate it into our more civilized world where we actually spend most of our time? So let me give you an example. How many people in here have an iPhone? Okay, most of the room. So this might be relatable or relevant in some way. So most of us know Apple. If you don't have an iPhone, potentially you have an iMac or an iSomething. So in 2010, Apple Corporation wanted to open a store in Georgetown, which is a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. It took 2 years for this to happen. Why? It doesn't make any sense, right? Georgetown, huge area of commerce. People go there specifically to shop, whether they're from D.C. or they're visiting to the monuments or the Capitol. It's a very big area for commerce and shopping. And you would think it was the only Apple store in Georgetown, so it was a very desired company, but it took them 2 years to open the store. Why? It was because the corporation was not allowed to build the same kind of store that they build everywhere else because of the parameters that the community placed on the corporation itself. For Georgetown, this meant that the Apple store would have to look like all of the other 100+ year buildings in that area. And here's just a couple views of Georgetown. So that's what the Apple store actually looks like. This is what Georgetown looks like. So it's been an area of commerce since the 1600s. A lot of its buildings are very historic, and it's what's called a place-making dividend in economic development circles. Georgetown is called a place-making dividend, which means that people stay longer, They come back more often, and therefore they spend more money because it attracts their affection again and again. It is unique. And people come there because of the sense they get when they walk down the streets of Georgetown, give or take the cars. That sense of being in an old city in the colonizing days is still there. Georgetown, as early as 1632, was the furthest upriver that ocean-going boats could go on the Potomac, so it's been an area of commerce for a very long time. It's played really instrumental roles in trade over the years. It knows that, as well as the corporations that come there. And so it has the ability as a community to say, yes, you can build here, but you're going to have to integrate with our design. You're not allowed to put in one of your fancy 21st century looking buildings. You're going to actually have to make this look like the place. You're going to have to blend in. So we can forget that even in something like urban planning, which might be as far away from the wilderness when we think back on what I've been talking about for the last 40 minutes, every building has a site, which means every site has some kind of neighborhood, and that means that every neighborhood is part of some kind of larger community. And given that we have that flow, it means that we can design and build places that are worth caring about, because it's different from somewhere else. And it also tends to attract people for that very same reason, so it feeds back into economics over time. How a city develops is largely based on the city's sense of place, and this can affect everything from city design to overall economic growth through time. Lots of polls have been shown for tourism that show that people want unique places. They want to go somewhere and feel like it's different than anywhere else they've ever been. So that means that my hometown is different from your hometown, if your hometown were Missoula, and that your hometown is different from the next person's hometown. And there's certain identifiers that you use. There's environmental and social cues that make you feel that this place is different from that place. However, it's the antithesis of most urban development right now. And we've seen that over the last few decades. My father works in construction and development, so we used to go back and forth about the utilitarian value of strip malls, because for about 25 years that was where construction was going. Of course, this is now going out of style in contemporary urban development because it's not unique. You can go into a strip mall anywhere across the country and feel like you're in the exact same place as somewhere else. We probably don't get that sense of place in Missoula, Montana when we're on Reserve Street. However, when we walk down Higgins Avenue, we probably feel a little bit more like we're in a specific place. We're in Missoula. We can see the river. We can see the cottonwoods. Author Wendell Berry once wrote, "If you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are." We all need points of reference and orientation, and often the distinctive attributes of our local environments can provide these orienting features. These may also include stories associated with places, like the story of the sleeping bear that I started out with, that gives us a more relatable piece of information that can be used in increasing our awareness and understanding of a place. So in the end, wilderness science is just another way of forming connection with place. This is a picture from the International Seminar on Protected Area Management that I run through the Wilderness Institute. And every year we bring 30 individuals from all over the world, largely from developing countries, that are interested in learning about protected area management and the models that we use here in the US, and how the lessons we've learned can be used before they make the same mistakes that we did in protected area management, as they're just starting to establish national parks and forest systems. And what's really neat about this program is that we take a group of individuals that have something professionally in common, but culturally largely have nothing in common, and put them together in wilderness settings for 3 weeks. And we let the wilderness work its magic. I facilitate some discussions, we have guest speakers, but largely the place and what they see from it is what they end up taking away, and it's what fills most of the conversations. And it's another way to connect. It's another way in which the wilderness and the research associated with it is used to form connection and a sense of place and storytelling environments where people can talk about what they know and how it affects what they're seeing in a given place. So, I always got to show a few photos of students while I'm talking. In talking about what it means to have a liberal education, author and professor that I really like, William Cronin, who came this fall in the presidential lecture series, wrote, "More than anything else, being an educated person means being able to see connections that allow one to make sense of the world and act within it in creative ways. Every one of the qualities I have described here, listening, reading, talking, writing, puzzle solving, truth seeking, seeing through other people's eyes, leading, working in a community, is finally about connecting. A liberal education is about gaining the power and the wisdom and the generosity and freedom to connect." And this is more relevant than ever. There was a study that came out that was quoted in The New Yorker last year. It was an article that was titled, "How Facebook Makes Us Unhappy." And what it looked at was the recent studies that illustrated the ways in which social networking can be advantageous or disadvantageous to our well-being. The author stated, "This aligns with research conducted earlier this year by John Eastwood and his colleagues at York University in a meta-analysis of boredom. What causes us to feel bored and, as a result, unhappy? It comes down to attention. When our attention is actively engaged, we aren't bored. When we fail to engage, boredom sets in. As Eastwood's work, along with recent research on media multitasking, have illustrated, the greater number of things we have pulling at our attention, the less we are able to meaningfully engage, and the more disconnected we become." In other words, meaningful connection is what determines our sense of belonging and connectedness. This, of course, can be brought to you by wilderness experience because it gets rid of some of those distractions. So to close with the illustration of this point, and in general, I would like to quote one of my students from this year's Wilderness and Civilization program, because I feel like she is probably, and her words are a better illustration of anything I could write. When we think about connection and what wilderness can do to connecting with a sense of self as well as a sense of place. So these are her words. Julia. "There is a difference between theoretical knowledge and the true holistic understanding that comes from experience. Our trip along the Rocky Mountain front was defined by experiential learning of the place that we were moving through. Care for a place isn't engendered from external formal education. It is difficult to feel care for something of which you have no memory-based experience. But I know for myself and every person in my group that we all now have a great care for the landscapes of the Badger 2 Medicine area. The place was not the backdrop for our backpacking trip, but an active and alive part of the experience. For a while, our human lives ran parallel to the life of the Rocky Mountain front ecosystem. This connection will endure throughout the semester as we now embark on the academic side of learning about wilderness. Hopefully, we will ultimately combine our experiential care with intellectual backing to help in the efforts to protect, conserve, and manage this special place." Yes, that was written by a 20-year-old. That is amazing. Students amaze me every day. I love it. So I hope for all of us that we find our many paths that lead us to connect with places, with people, places where we feel free to express our most creative selves, to push us forward, chasing our passions and exploring our world, and in doing so, affect the change so necessary to keep all of us in this world moving forward. And so with that, I'll close with an Ed Abbey quote that I feel like fits a roundabout very well. "As you travel on through life, brother, whatever be your goal, keep your eye upon the donut and not upon the hole." That's all. I have about 10 minutes. I know I covered a lot of different things in that talk, so feel free to ask me questions or just comment or discuss in general. Anybody? Yes?
I'm kind of curious as to why you use ethanol instead of water to drown the hogs.
Oh. Preservation. So the ethanol will preserve the tissues intact, where water will actually degrade the DNA. So the ethanol, it won't, unless under extreme temperatures, won't freeze. And it is a lot less finicky than water is that way. Yes.
Since you've been to like so many different areas, where do you find your sense of place?
Ooh, that's a good one. There's a great story by David James Duncan in his book, My Story is Told by Water, and he writes an essay called Non-Sense of Place, and it speaks really well because it talks about the fact that many of us don't have an innate sense of place, so we don't have I can go home to Detroit, Michigan, and it feels like home. It's where I grew up, but it's not where I really connect with people. I mean, I don't have anyone there except my parents anymore. So the strongest sense of place I've ever had is Alaska, and I feel like it's just from my years of working up there. I'm recreating to some extent and living, yes, but I've lived and recreated in other places, and I feel like what really brings me back to that place over and over again is the fact that I spent 10 years literally crawling around on the ground in many parts of that state trying to look at the very minute details of places that might be overlooked by others. So yeah, but not one place up there in particular. It's more like it's sensory. It's like the way Labrador tea smells in late August, or the way that cottonwoods smell in spring. And we get that here, and it'll bring me back to specific places in Alaska. I look at Rick because you probably understand what those things smell like as well. So yeah, so it is more sensory cues than anything.
Could you tell us about one of your ideas or plans for what you want to do in the future?
It's a good job interview question. Well, so my identity crisis was, do I move out of a research-based life into an education, more of an educator position? And my real passion is teaching. Research is secondary to that. There's a lot that can be learned from research that can carry over into the classroom, and I think it makes me a better, more well-informed, up-to-date educator. But I really love teaching, and I love creating opportunities for students to have their own magical discovery moments. And so that's where I see myself now and into the future as well, is different ways programmatically as an administrator, but as well as an educator, to get students out and about and to use these areas that are public lands for exploration and discovery and research, and facilitate those experiences. So kind of moving out of that role of a researcher into a facilitator.
This is going to play off of Julia's question. Being the director of the Wilderness and Civilization Program, how would you like to see it changed or improved, or I don't know, however you want to do that question?
I mean, a real specific way that I could see it being, see it evolve over time is into a block system where we can take students on one course for 3 weeks at a time and really focus in. So because it would give us the opportunity to say, if for the literature course, if you read Norman MacLean's essay on the ranger cooking the hole in the sky, you could actually walk that transect through the Bitterroot as he described it through his essay. And so you could take more of those place-based education opportunities with the other courses in the program, other than just that first opportunity at the beginning of the program and then the little retreat at the end. I mean, that's kind of like a real programmatic thing I think about, but keeping, at the core, keeping and really pushing that interdisciplinary programmatic design going forward is, I think, ever more important as we try to focus on giving students the opportunity to become global citizens, having that humanities, that visual and performing arts, that tangible science, creative writing, all those skills as they go forward is, I think, going to be ever more important.
I was at a research conference earlier today, and something struck me there that has sort of bugged me for a while, and it's this issue of sort of sense of place in research, and that is that increasingly research seems to be getting more and more technological and less field-based. And, researchers, and you, the way you describe your research, you spend a lot of time out there in the field. But now it seems to be, let's put a collar or a transmitter on the animal, and then we'll sit in our lab and we'll learn all about this animal's behavior from what the GPS tells us. And I wonder, you know, if you think that that's just sort of inevitable, that it's going to continue to evolve in that direction, and what that means if it's true, and especially in the context of wilderness.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great question, and one that I've seen over the years. Being in the field of genetics, it's very easy for somebody else to go out and collect the samples or to get them from trappers and hunters that are out there and never actually have to go into the field and collect your own data. It's going to affect your sample size and where you get it from, but it's possible. And I've seen people do theses and dissertations without ever stepping foot on the area where they were supposedly studying. So it's definitely been something I've seen evolve over the years. And there's been a push from folks in academia back towards traditional natural history, that the value of what some of the really early naturalists were able to do by, you know, walking transects and cataloging everything that was there is a very necessary skill as we try to monitor over time change, because it's impossible to monitor all change in an environment without actually being out there watching it happen over time. But I don't have an answer. I do feel like it depends on some level on the individual researcher and the tools they use as to whether or not they're going to go more into go more down the technological path. Modeling was really big for about 10 years with the once climate change research really got going, it shifted all towards modeling. And I think that's, to some extent, that work has slowed, and we're going back to revisiting those models with ground truthing information and old historic natural history information. But you know, it doesn't really answer the question. I do feel like that trajectory is still moving in a forward momentum, especially in the field of genetics, because there's more and more samples available based on all these earlier studies that people can use without ever having to go on the ground and actually look at the broader system. But yeah, that's a really good point. And I fear for research that goes totally in that direction, because there's a lot of value to being out there on the ground and watching those nuances on a daily basis in a given field site, to really understanding what might be some of the drivers in the change that you're trying to measure as a researcher. That if I hadn't been out there, like one of my field sites, we found wolves eating. There's an island where there's lots of black bears, the highest black bear density in the world, supposedly, 1.5 black bears per square kilometer, which is a funny thing to think about, 1.5 bears. But there's a lot of wolves. There were 4 wolf packs that I counted, and I mean, I didn't do any work with the wolf packs, but 4 distinct areas where wolves were acting in pack formations. I found 4 distinct denning locations. And we're like, what are these wolves eating? There were no deer on this island. And we found out just through scats that we found black bear hair and bones. It was the first known case of an apex predator feeding on another apex predator in a system that we wouldn't have otherwise ever known hadn't we actually just been wandering around in the rain, in the woods, looking at poop, because that was just what we did. So I hope it doesn't go that way. Any more? I can take one more question. All right, well, thank you. Have a good night.